Wow, now it's exactly noon. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a few seconds after noon, so I can say afternoon. So today we're very happy to have this quantitative history lecture by Professor Mark Hopp. He is an assistant professor of economics at Peking University at the School of Economics there. Some of you have heard him giving talks here before, so I don't need to spend too much time on his background. But his main area of research is on the economic history of Indonesia. So this is why today he's going to speak on labor coercion and trade evidence from Indonesia. So let's all welcome Mark. Okay, here we go.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. So indeed, I'm going to talk about coercion and trade, evidence from colonial Indonesia. So, oh wait, let me see if it works. Yeah, now it works. Okay, so what's the general research question I have in mind? Well, it's this one. So what determines fiscal modernization and labor coercion? And with fiscal modernization, we mean this transition towards relatively information-intensive forms of monetary taxation. So you can think, for example, nowadays we're used to paying an income tax, but that hasn't been around for too long. In the past, the states taxed in many different ways. Some of them were less information-intensive than other forms. Now, the specific question I ask is, what's the effect of trade on corvée labor? So what was corvée labor? Well, corvée labor was this taxation in kind in the form of labor. So people paid part of their taxes by working for the state without getting paid for it. And they were told by the state basically what to work on. And that could be several weeks or maybe 2 months per year, for example. And this is a prime example of a taxation with relatively low information requirements. So the state, for example, doesn't need to know, okay, who earns what? What's the value of the land, for example, to be able to levy this taxation? The state needs to know basically how many people live in this area, in this village, for example, and can we then make them work, for example, to provide some goods, for example. So you may ask, well, why use corvée? Why would the state want to use corvée? Well, there are several advantages from the central state's perspective. So one is that there are minimal requirements, as I just said, on information collection capabilities of the state, and there are minimal requirements on both the level of productivity and the level of monetization in the economy. So if there's a lot of exchange going on in kind, for example, rather than via cash, then it's difficult to levy cash-based taxation. So this type of in-kind taxation could be more easy to levy. Now, it also allows for a high level of local discretion. So the local officials had a lot of discretion in managing this system, in setting the level of corvée up to some maximum, which was set by the center, and also in allocating that corvée across different tasks, for example. So it can rely on this local knowledge, and it can adapt to local circumstances. So if there is, for example, a flood happening somewhere, then the local officials could make people come out and repair whatever got damaged right away. Now, it can also be useful when the central state is unable to credibly commit from appropriating local taxes away from local officials. So if you move to monetary taxation, this monetary taxation is a lot more easy for the central state to appropriate and to shift to the center, away from the local officials. So it can be an important part of, you could say, this informal contract between the central state and the local level officials, because it's difficult for the central state to take away this corvée from local purposes. Basically, this corvée had to be used in a certain parameter around villages where people lived. Now, we know, though, that even though this corvée was historically widespread, nowadays it's mainly mostly phased out around the world. So there must have been some disadvantages, right, to explain that phase out. And indeed, as I said just now, from the central state's perspective, if you do this in-kind taxation, it has low fungibility, storability, and portability compared to cash taxation. So it makes it difficult, for example, to enable cross-province transfers. And there are potentially high opportunity costs for both the state and the laborer, because the state has an encompassing interest. It doesn't only tax with corvée, it taxes in many different ways. But if you make people provide corvée labor for a month per year, they can produce other goods, which would eventually also be taxed by the state, which would result in cash taxation, for example, at the harbor when goods are exported. Now, also, that high level of local discretion, which may be beneficial for the central state, can also be a problem because these local officials are wage earners. They don't necessarily internalize the negative effects that corvée has on other forms of taxation. So if a laborer is made to work corvée labor for a month and a half in a year, for example, they can't produce coffee that would eventually be exported at the harbor and taxed, and that tax money would go to the central state, right? They are not these residual claimants, these local officials that have that discretion. So what's my hypothesis? Well, my hypothesis is that trade booms reduce corvée labor, and it goes through these increased opportunity costs, both for the state and also the laborers. So the state loses monetary taxes, and the laborers lose, well, wages and sales that they could have accomplished if they were not made to perform corvée labor. But the state here faces an information problem. It's not really able to distinguish the laborers in terms of their productivity. There are hundreds of thousands of people performing corvée. Some people would be highly productive in private activity. Some people would be relatively less productive. The state doesn't have that information to distinguish them. The state mainly wants low opportunity cost laborers to perform the corvée labor. Now, what can it then do? What could be a potential solution? A solution could be a so-called buyout option, or what was also known as a ransom option, that enabled these people who were subject to corvée to pay a certain amount of money, and then they would not be subject to corvée anymore for that given year. So they would buy themselves out for a given year. So what this enables then is the high opportunity cost laborers, the highly productive laborers, to self-select out of corvée labor, because they have some idea about, okay, if don't have to do this corvée for a month, I can earn this amount of money. So and this is the buyout fee, it's worth it for me to pay that buyout fee. So it utilizes this private information that laborers have. So give you a brief preview. So what I do is I built the first data set on the actual usage of corvée and also exports, and therefore do the first estimation of this effect of trade on corvée usage. And the main result is that these export booms, especially in labor-intensive goods, reduce this form of public labor coercion. And the mechanism exactly worked through those buyouts. So people face higher opportunity costs, so they're more willing to buy themselves out. And they face these higher opportunity costs when there is a trade boom. So you may ask still at this moment, why study this, right? Why study fiscal modernization? So fiscal capacity is seen as a key aspect of long-run development. And to build that fiscal capacity, this fiscal modernization is an important facet of that, moving towards different, more cash-intensive forms of taxation, for example. And in-kind taxation in the form of this unpaid coerced labor was historically widespread, and it's actually still in use today in some developing countries. So you can think about major projects like the Great Pyramid of Giza or the Great Wall of China. They were partially built with this type of unpaid labor. Now, then you may ask, okay, we're economists, why study coercion, right? Well, if we think about labor allocation historically, a lot of it was not done through wages, but through coercion. So there's this quote that says, well, you could say in the context of universal history, this free labor, this wage labor actually is the peculiar institution, even though we're used to it nowadays. So we can think about all these different forms that coercion has taken throughout history, and in all the different settings, where coerced labor was arguably more important than wage labor. Now, also, as I said just now, it's still present today. So the ILO estimates about 25 million people are still subject to some form of forced labor today. But the data are a bit more uncertain for modern day times. Now, why then study this using history? So I think for you, I don't really need to defend like why it may be interesting to look at something historical, but there are some distinct advantages. So one is that we can take this long time frame. So today I will look at a 40-year period from 1900 to 1940 that captures a major trade boom after World War I and a major trade bust during the Great Depression. So we can capture these infrequent shocks. And we know coercion happens today, but the data is often very poor because it's illegal. But this was a legal form of coercion. The state had a strong incentive to collect information on this. It wanted to know what were people made to do, basically, because it wanted to know what's the overall tax pressure also in the economy. So what's the setting? Well, like I said, colonial Indonesia, 1900 to 1940, and I built this new annual subnational panel data based on primary sources. So the two main variables that I collect information on is this usage of corvée in number of days and the exports. So why then study Indonesia, besides the fact that it's large and interesting for its own reasons? Well, again, there are some distinct advantages, this unique data availability. So there's residency year level data on the usage of corvée for at least 70 years, but I'm going to look at the last 40 years of that period today. So that data on usage is quite unique. So for many other places, there may be some data about, well, this is the amount of corvée people could legally be made to provide, but we don't know what's the actual provision. So we don't know the variation across time and across space, for example. And the other unique part of this data is that residency product year level data on exports. And that's because of the unique geography of Indonesia. So I can show you here. So these are the so-called outer island residencies and Java in the middle. So I don't look at Java today, but at all the other residencies are included in this study. And as you see, they all have access to the seas. They all had their own harbors. At the harbors, customs were imposed on exports. So they collected data on what are the exports coming from this province. So we have a much better idea about what's actually produced in these provinces compared to countries with a lot of inland production. So let's say China or the US, a lot may be exported through Shanghai perhaps, but it's difficult to go find out where was it actually produced. But in Indonesia, that's not the case because there was much less overland transport in these outer island residencies. So not in Java. In Java, that's a problem, but I don't include Java today, also for because corvée was phased out there a bit earlier. Now, another aspect is that this corvée labor was very important and had a lot of variance. So hundreds of thousands of people were working and they were providing millions of unpaid labor days. And the exports varied a lot across those provinces as well. And there are these mechanisms that link trade, productivity, and coercion through that ransom option, for example. And because you could see Indonesia as a small open economy, global market shocks will have a large impact on productivity levels in that economy. So this aids identification in this setting. So the residencies were differently specialized in different export goods. So whenever there's a world market price shock, they're going to expose these different, going to impact these residencies to a different extent. Now, there's a long-standing debate on what explains labor coercion. And there are two seminal theories that link labor productivity to coercion. So we could call this Domar's price effect and North and Thomas's outside options effect. So what is the price effect? Well, the price effect states that if labor productivity goes up, coercion also goes up. So the idea behind this is that, well, if labor is productive, that means labor as an input is probably quite relatively expensive. And the things that you produce through labor can command a high output price. So now employers, they don't want to pay laborers. They want to coerce them to work. They don't want to pay those high wage costs. and they want to produce more because they can sell at higher prices. So they have an incentive to use more coercion. And this explains, for example, why we see importation of slaves, for example, to labor scarce areas in the Americas. Now, the outside options effect has the opposite prediction. If there's more productivity, coercion should go down. And here, the idea is that, well, if labor is productive, they have more bargaining power. They could move away and perhaps command a higher wage, better living standards somewhere else. So it lowers the employer's power, so they have to reduce coercion, basically in this bargaining setting. And that's the main explanation for why we see serfdom go away in Western Europe after the Black Death, for example. Now, Acemoglu and Wolitsky unite these two theories into one. So then the idea is that, well, either effect can dominate depending on this difference between the outside price and the outside option. So it's theoretically ambiguous. You will have to, in a way, test it empirically to see what's more important in any given setting. Now, what I think is happening here, though, in this debate is that it focuses a lot on private coercion. But public coercion works differently because the state differs from private employers because it has that encompassing interest in the overall output of an economy. So the idea is that, as I said earlier, the state taxes in different ways. If it uses corvée, less export goods will be produced, so less export tax revenues will go to the state. So it doesn't want to hurt private production too much. It doesn't want to make people provide corvée 10 months out of the year, for example. So if labor has a high marginal revenue product, the state prefers not to use corvée and just tax laborers' output. And then it could use those tax revenues to hire labor to provide, build roads, for example. So this higher MRP can come from higher productivity, can come from higher prices. I think what happened in Indonesia is dominated by these prices because we see the changes happening so quickly. Basically cannot be explained by productivity changes that tend to go more slowly. So these trade booms and busts, they affect these prices immediately and substantially. So I built a very simple model, more of like a conceptual framework, you could think of it. So let's think of the state facing this problem. And it can choose a forced labor rate F and some tax rate tau. And it wants to maximize this objective function. So it gets some utility from using forced labor. So that's H of F here. It also gets some utility from cash taxation. So the idea is that this F forced labor rate is somewhere between 0 and 1. So you get some utility from that as a state, but the more corvée labor you use, the less is available for private production. So that's here, comes in here on the left-hand side, the 1 minus F. So people have less time to produce coffee, rubber, for example. And this input in private production gets multiplied with some productivity level A, some price level P, and then here some tax rate tau, and also some, you could say, some distortionary impact of taxation, R of tau. So the idea is that the state tries to balance these two, because the higher is F on the right-hand side here, the lower, less time is available for private production. But it also needs to think about this, you could say, a subsistence constraint for the laborers. It can't put F all the way up at 1, for example. People need to produce something to provide for themselves. But you can think of this as a no revolt condition as well. Now, in the non-binding constraint, which I think is the most appropriate here, because people were not living at the subsistence level. We see quite a large increase in population levels, for example. The first order conditions, so they're very simple. They resolve in this manner. So the comparative statics then show that, well, if there's a positive price shock, the state has an incentive to reduce the corvée labor rate, F star. And the same for if there's a positive productivity shock. It's the same, we expect to see the same movement, same direction. So this very simple model explains some major patterns in the data. That's the post-World War I trade boom going with a collapsing corvée and a depression trade bust going with a resurgence in corvée. So we see the state taxes both in labor and in output, and we see that opportunity cost. And that's what induces the state to limit corvée, even though it's nominally free, right? It doesn't pay these laborers any money. So again, if the MRP is high, the type of taxation, would the state want to change that? And trade booms and busts directly affect this MRP. Now, this very simple model has several problems, right? But one major problem is that the state has this information problem. It doesn't really know what the level of productivity of all the individual laborers. So it wants to let these low productivity laborers perform corvée. So the model assumes away these, you could say, imperfect information issues. So the solution then is exactly that ransom option. Let people buy off their corvée duty. They can decide themselves whether they want to do it or not. And people have some idea about what they could earn in a given year. So this enables the state to move from in-kind to cash taxation without putting any higher demands on information collection capabilities of the state, information analysis capabilities of the state. So this, again, the main hypothesis. We get a trade boom, MRP would go up, ransoming, right, buying out would go up, and corvée would go down. So let me stop here. Is there any question at this moment? Feel free to, yes.
Proxy, just to measure the degree of monetarization of output and exchanges and so on. Because if the monetarization level is very high, then it should give you the same outcome as what you're predicting here, right? Of course, when it's low, then corvée labor would become a more optimal option.
So it's difficult for me to get that at the residency level. It's difficult for me to track, like, where does the coinage flow to, for example. But I do think that's part of the story, because now people can produce more exports. They get paid for it, and they can use that money either, for example, the next year to buy off their corvée labor duty. So that's part of the story indeed, that now if they produce more coffee, they sell it. That's part of the story indeed, that monetization adds to it. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can empirically measure other way where I can distinguish it. Yeah.
Well, I guess this bi-directional effect is hard to decompose, right? In the sense that maybe someone in the colonial government realized, well, we cannot do we cannot do cash taxation because people's income was not so much in cash or in monetary forms. So let's push trade. And then, because when we push trade from the government's perspective, then we can make use of corvée labor to make trade happen, right? Yeah. So that would lead to increased level of monetarization for the whole economy, which would afford more degrees of cash taxation, right? So this reinforcing process can go on. But of course, in the end, then corvée labor would become unnecessary once the level of monetarization through trade reaches a high enough level. Then the options for the government would become totally different.
Yeah, so we see that happening in Java. So their corvée labor is completely phased out by 1916. And then these two small islands, Bangka and Belitung, a lot of tin is produced there. Corvée labor is phased out in 1919 and 1920. It doesn't come back. It's basically, it's the central government decision to phase it out. And it's replaced with a head tax. So now people pay it cash, basically.
So promoting trade at that time turns out to be a very smart innovation, right?
To help this, in a way, fiscal modernization too.
Yeah, and other things.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the governmental strategy to boost more export production.
So why didn't the indigenous government, before the Dutch came over, do a similar, innovation? Why didn't they do that?
Yeah, well, I think the setting was very different, because now I'm looking at early 20th century. So now you can produce in Indonesia and ship it to Europe or North America, for example. And that wasn't really possible to that extent in, let's say, 1700s. So then it's really about those high value products like pepper, for example. But now we see these bulky products also being exported. So I think that the setting is also different. Yeah.
I thought the Dutch made Indonesia a colony in the early 1700s.
Yeah, indeed. So the
they,
Spice Islands. Yeah.
So they had had a long time to do something like this.
Yeah. But so that was centered on exactly on Java and basically the Moluccas. Let me go back to this map. So I know, can I use a, here. So here, for example, the Spice Islands, and here Java, that's where that was centered at in the 1700s, 1600s. But now here a lot of export production is, for example, happening in East Sumatra. And that was only really getting into play around 1880 from that point onward, basically. All right, was there any other question?
So this is Derek from Real Estate. I found topic very interesting. So because I'm not that familiar with Indonesia, so I hope to hear more about the some information about the finance system. Because I think it's very smart to use this buyout option to utilize their own private information. But if I am very high in MRP, I hope to buy out, but I do not have money. So what can I do? Maybe I can borrow money from bank, or I can do some informal borrowing, right? Yeah. So I'm just asking if your treatment is actually correlated with the finance system.
Yeah. So to some extent, I'm sure it would be. So, but this type of informal lending, like there's no surviving data on it. But I don't see it like in the descriptives, let's say. I don't see people say people borrowed money to pay off their corvée duty. I think what seems to be more happening is that if people had a good year, they can save some money and then pay off their corvée duty the next year. So I think later I will show you a graph with the ransoming seems to kind of be lagged 1 year after exports.
So how expensive is this buyout option?
Yeah, so that's a little bit, so I don't know exactly. So I can calculate the ransom per ransomer, and then it seems to hover around, let's say 6 guilders. So that was maybe, depending on what area you're looking at, maybe 20 days of wages, basically, something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? Okay, if not, then let's get on to the data. So what was this used for? So it was mainly used for constructing, maintaining, and guarding roads, bridges, and irrigation networks, for example. And these local colonial officials kept these detailed records and sent them up the bureaucratic chain of command. So that's what enables me to manually construct this data set. So this is what the sources look like on the corvée labor. So here we see the different provinces or residencies, for example. And here we see the number of people that are liable to corvée labor. So let's say here in Tapanuli, 77,000 people. And here, the maximum number of days that they could legally be made to provide corvée labor. So that was 2.7 million days for Tapanuli. And here we see, for example, what were the days used for? Okay, maintaining roads, that's what we see in this column. So the records go on to other pages as well. So here, this is part of that unique data where they actually kept the usage records about how much of this corvée was used. Now, the other part of the data are the exports, right? So that's what we see here. So here we see the exports. Here we see the type of product, the destination, the quantity, and the value. So this is, for example, for the west coast of Sumatra. So they were exporting coffee, peels, other, because it's very detailed. They have different types of coffee that they have data on. So we see, all right, they exported 2.3 million kilograms, and it was worth 3.1 million guilders for that particular year, that particular residency, that particular product. So that's how we can construct this data set. So if we just plot the data, it looks like this. So in blue, we have the use days. It peaks around 25 million days per year. Now, initially, it also goes up. Part of that is an artifact of the data because it's an unbalanced panel. Some residencies enter the data set a bit later, but it peaks here, 25 million days. And then you see a very steep drop. And it kind of stays stable and it drops further. And then when the Great Depression hits, it shoots back up to corvée labor. It goes up again by more than 10 million days, or around 10 million days, let's say. And in the red line that's here on the right-hand side, those are the exports. So we see a big positive shock after World War I, when basically trade resurged again. And that coincides with that drop in corvée. And then we see a further boom in the late 1920s, again, coinciding with this drop in corvée. And then with the Depression, trade collapses. Corvée comes back. So it seems to indicate this negative relationship between these two. When exports go up, corvée goes down, and vice versa. Now, this is for all the residencies together. For some residencies, the pattern is even clearer than this. So this is for that West Sumatra that I showed earlier. So corvée hovers around 6 million days in the early 1900s. But we get that trade boom after World War I. Corvée basically drops to zero. Everybody is buying themselves out, basically. And we have the Great Depression hit. Corvée shoots back up to maybe around 3.5 million days per year. Quite a fraction of people stop buying themselves out. They self-select back into corvée labor. So where do these trade shocks come from? So an important part or cause are these price shocks, price changes. So this is where I plot the price index for petroleum. So at 100, that's when the price peaked. So for petroleum, the price peaked around 1990, 1920. I think 1919 it is, right? So it kind of coincides with World War I. There was a lot of demand for oil. But we see, so a vast rise and a fast decline, substantial price shock to this product. When we look at pepper, we see a substantial price shock as well and a price fall, but it's happening later. It's not happening at the same time. And we can also plot, for example, rubber, so in green. So there's a boom, again, during World War I. It kind of collapses. It resurges in the mid-1920s, and then it collapses again afterwards. So products, they experience price shocks to a different extent at different time periods. And this is also going to matter because of the export composition. So this is for all the outer island residencies together. So these are the main export products. So we see oil here in purple is one of the major export products at the time. And we see that the value of that boom here in 1919, when that price shock also happened. And rubber in red, we see it boom around 1925, when that price shock to rubber occurred. So we see different products experiencing these different shocks at different times. So what's important in the story here is that these different residencies were differently specialized. So if we look at the West Sumatra, that had that very clear pattern, then we see it doesn't produce any oil. There's no purple here. It produces all these other goods that are relatively labor intensive. So it produces a lot of coffee, for example, quite a bit of oily seeds like coconuts, palm oil, that kind of stuff. And it participates in this rubber boom in the mid-1920s. So it's very different from Palembang, for example, where oil is the major export product. More than half of the exports for Palembang are the oil products. So this is going to matter because very few people are involved in oil production, as I'll mention a bit later. Now, what I want to do is I have these used corvée days per capita, and we can decompose that into 3 different components to try and find out where are these movements coming from. So we can look at the amount of people that were liable relative to the population, so liable per capita. We can look at, well, if you're liable to be a corvée laborer, what's the maximum amount of days you could be made to work per year? So max days per liable. And then what's the share of max days that is actually being used of corvée labor? So the idea is that these first 2 components, we can think of as policy levers determined by the central government. So they can determine the liable per capita, the max days per liable. These are relatively broad brush measures, and they're inflexible in the sense that they don't change from year to year or from individual to individual, basically. They're set by decree, basically, political decree. Now, this last component, that is where the room for individual ransoming is. So here, this is largely individually determined. and it's specific to the individual, they can decide to ransom themselves or not. So then the max days stays the same, but the use days would go down. And it's flexible, right? It can respond to trade booms and busts. So we can also plot that. So this is, for example, the maximum days per liable. And that's, it's around 52 days per year. So 1 day per week. And this is the supremum across all residencies. And we see it going down over time. So that's basically the central state trying to reduce this corvée because they want to move to other forms of taxation. If we weigh it by the amount of people that are liable in any given residency, we see this movement. So we see this kind of decline happening around World War I. So that's part of the story in that earlier decline. But then it's kind of fixed throughout the 1920s and when the Great Depression hits in 1929. So that's different from this pattern, right? In use days per liable, we saw that collapse in World War I, further collapse, late 20s, resurgence, early 30s. So from 1920 onwards, we can get data on the people who bought themselves out. So we can plot that here. So if you didn't buy yourself out, you're a corvée laborer. For those people, they had to provide about 18 or 19 days per year. And it's quite stable. So if you didn't buy yourself out, you could expect, well, on average, I'll probably have to work 19 days next year without pay if I don't buy myself out. So that shows that these drops come from people buying themselves out rather than the state making everybody work less, for example. Okay, so these are the basic specifications, right? We have all those components. We're going to look at exports per capita along with some year fixed effects and residency fixed effects. And we're going to cluster the errors, apply small sample correction, and weight by the number of liable laborers in these residencies. So still there are some potential issues here, right? So one is, well, potential reverse causality. If you use a lot of corvée now, it may reduce output of export goods. So that Y may affect the X. And those capital intensive exports like oil, we don't expect that to be a strong relationship because so few people work in the oil industry. So it's not going to affect people's ransoming decisions. So if we look at Sumatra, about 1% of people were involved in the petroleum industry, 80%, more than 80% in agriculture. Now, because we have that product level data, we can separate these products, right? We can take out oil and we only look at non-oil products, and we can lag the quantities, but still use the current prices to try and mitigate that reverse causality issue to some extent. So here we call it the potential exports, no oil, for example. So we can put those in the regression as a replacement for exports per capita. So what this enables us to do is we can use this variation in shocks because we have so many shocks, so many different products, 35 different product categories, even though we know, okay, the exposure is potentially endogenous, but we have a lot of shocks happening here. So again, this exposure differs. For example, if we look at rubber, 92% of export value in Tapanuli, 0% in Bali and Lombok. So that's that different specialization. So again, these are just the basic specifications. This is going to be column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, just to show you what the tables will show us. So if we use exports per capita, all products, okay, we see a negative relationship, but it's kind of fuzzy, measured with a lot of error. If we look at that last component, right, that we think is determined by ransoming to the largest extent, okay, we see the effect goes through that, but still it's only marginally significant. But we can exclude all the oil products. And then we see this relationship being much stronger, appearing here in the 4th column, not in those two policy levers. So this change indeed seems to come through what's mainly determined by these ransoming decisions. So this shows every 10% increase in exports per capita that are non-oil products, corvée usage would go down by about 2%. But we saw exports in that period basically tripling. So it's it explains a massive part of the decline in corvée usage with this coefficient estimate. So again, we can use that potential exports per capita. Okay, we see a negative relationship, but not statistically significant. We can exclude oil, and then we really see that relationship come back. So again, the magnitude of results is that basically the increase in non-oil exports can nearly fully explain that drop in corvée with that coefficient that we have, that estimate that we have. So there are several robustness checks I do, but I think the most interesting one is the placebo test. Because we have oil exports, we don't expect there to be a relationship between oil exports and corvée usage, so that we can use that as a placebo. And indeed, if we do that, here we're only using oil exports per capita. There's basically no relationship. It doesn't show up because so few people are involved. It's not going to influence people's marginal revenue product. And again, these are the potential exports per capita, only oil, same. We don't see anything. So what are the mechanisms here? Well, with higher prices, workers would tend to be more productive in private production. So that marginal productivity is larger. If it's larger than the corvée ransom charge, people will pay off their duties. And it's beneficial for the state because they get the ransom payments now. People will produce coffee, it's get exported later in the year and will get taxed at the harbor. So the state will get customs revenues too, for example, later in the year. So if we plot that ransom data, so that we get that from 1920 onward. So ransoming was really instituted nationwide in 1918. So earlier it was possible in some places, but it wasn't universal. But we get the data from 1920 onward. So we see it's basically, this is the number of ransomers. So that's on the left-hand side. So 300,000 people paid off their duties in 1920. It basically goes up and up and up to about 900,000 people in 1929. And then we see, okay, the Great Depression, people don't buy themselves out anymore. They self-select back into the corvée. So here we see exactly a positive relationship as we would expect. And again, some individual residencies, it's even clearer, right? So again, if we look at West Sumatra, we see the very clear co-movement of people ransoming and the exports for that particular residency. So we can also put that in the regression framework. So now let's look at the amount of money that was ransomed per capita and the number of people who ransomed themselves per capita. So we would expect a positive relationship. And indeed, that's what we see. And again, if we only look at non-oil products, it's a stronger relationship. Now, the problem here is that we don't have the World War I trade boom because we only have data from 1920 onward. So if we look at potential exports per capita, we lose the statistical significance. But I think part of that is we don't have that very massive first boom to begin with, but still positive coefficient. So this negative relationship that we find here, well, it's between trade and public coercion. It contrasts with certain other studies that focus on private labor coercion. And here what's important is, I think, that encompassing interest of the state. So if the state could reduce corvée, it could get higher tax revenues in another way, in other manners. So the nature of the relationship between the coercer and the coerced, but also the purpose that it's put to, matters for this relationship between trade and coercion. It's negative in this case. It may be positive in slaveholder-slave case, for example. So if the cotton price goes up, slaveholders may want to import more slave labor or make the slaves work more because they want to produce more cotton, sell more cotton. But we don't see that same mechanism in this case, in the corvée labor case. Okay, so to conclude, what I do is I build this first data set on usage and exports. And I think especially the trade data set has many potential applications beyond this particular study, this residency product year level data that we have on exports. And the main result is that those export booms, especially in labor-intensive goods, reduce public labor coercion. And the main mechanism went through those buyouts, the higher opportunity costs that laborers face. So what are some takeaways that I think we can take from this study? Well, one is that fiscal modernization, coercion, and trade are tightly intertwined. And we see this increasing productivity play an important role in Indonesia. It likely played an important role elsewhere as well. And it may have been trade-induced elsewhere as well, but the data may be more difficult to get for other places. But I think this is in a way, like a universal relationship that we are just able to test in the Indonesian setting. Another aspect is that, well, if you only look at monetary tax revenues per capita, it can hide falling in-kind tax revenues. So here we see a replacement. And it's the same in Java. So we didn't look at that today. It's the same in Java. Corvée labor gets replaced with a head tax. So if you only look at head tax, it goes up over time. You may think, oh, the state is able to tax more. Its fiscal capacity is stronger. But actually, it's a replacement of an in-kind form of taxation that may be more difficult to be able to track in other settings. And finally, these booms and busts in trade can affect the tax structure. So the type of taxation that a state may want to use is influenced by these trade booms and busts. And as we saw, right, that economic downturn, the Great Depression, induced this movement back into corvée labor, into coercion, into more or less, you could say, informal taxation. At least nowadays, it's often used as informal taxation. So that may still happen today. So if the 2020 economic shock, for example, in some developing countries, if you only look at monetary tax pressure, for example, that people face, and maybe that goes down in an economic downturn, but you don't see that maybe at the local level, people now provide labor, unpaid labor to the state, rather than paying taxes in cash. So it's important to try and get data on that too in some modern day settings in certain countries. All right, so I'll end here. So thank you.
So, questions? Simon.
Thank you for your presentation. There's one, I don't know whether you covered that actually in your presentation, because sorry, I arrived a little bit late. Actually, in terms of how, if actually COVID labor actually was, in terms of coercion, what's the subsistence actually for the labor during that period of COVID labor? I mention this because in Mesopotamia, this really COVID labor is a long-standing tradition actually. All the way actually about, already in the 2 millennium BC. And they provide a ration actually for the labor during that period. So although they do not get a wages, but they do get a ration. So I just wondering in Indonesia, what is the subsistence for the labor?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. They were not provided any food, yeah. So I think the difference with Mesopotamia, maybe in Mesopotamia, people provided more corvée labor per year, maybe, I don't know, maybe 2-3 months per year. So they would have to also be provided food. So here it's one form of taxation. And so people were provided, let's say, were expected for maybe those 3 weeks per year that they would be made to do corvée. They could be spread out throughout the year. So maybe 2 days here, 2 days there, for example. And people would be expected to bring their own food. So what you do sometimes then also see, so if people did not perform the corvée labor, they could be punished. So they could be put in jail, or they could get a fine as well. But then the problem was that if people go to jail, they get free food in jail. So they may prefer jail over corvée labor. So then what the state, initially it said it's illegal to, if people serve their sentence, to then still make them do the corvée labor. But then the problem is like people may prefer the jail, right? So then what happened is that actually kind of like off the books, if people would be released from jail. So it wouldn't necessarily be too long, maybe like 1 week in jail, for example, 2 weeks perhaps. There are individual differences. But then afterwards, they would still need to do their corvée. So now there's no incentive to like skip on the corvée, basically. There's no way to get out of it unless you buy off the duty. So yeah, so they were not provided food. Yeah, that was like they had to provide their own food.
Sorry. First, let me remind those who are online that if you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A box. So any other questions or comments? So maybe, so Mark, I think the main conclusion is that fiscal modernization and state capacity building through trade I mean, that's of course an option available to Indonesia. But for other contexts, other countries where the waterways may not be as abundant or naturally provided, this might not have been an option. Like for example, for China, for the most part, right? Landlocked, most of the territorial areas in historical China were landlocked. You know, developing or growing trade was not so feasible for the most part. Of course, you know, the canal system was constructed that made interregional trade more possible. So the main conclusion you have drawn may not apply, right, in other contexts. But I wonder what other ways different historical societies pursued to really stimulate fiscal modernization and fiscal state capacity building.
Yeah, so in Java, for example, so they used the cultivation system. So that was in the mid 1800s. So there indeed, they basically said, so every village had to put part of the village land to produce export goods, cash crops, basically, like indigo, for example. And then they would have to sell those goods at a preset price to the state. And then that's one way indeed of monetizing the economy. So then now people have some more cash. They can pay other taxation, like a land tax, for example. They can then pay that in cash. So indeed, that was part of the strategy in Java for sure, where they used that cultivation system. But that was so that was mainly phased out in this time period. So that was phased out around 1870. Yeah, but indeed, it's definitely part of the story that the state wants to have more monetization, basically, wants to have more development, more cash tax revenues.
So in this sense, I wonder whether storability or perishability of the main food crops would actually make a difference in terms of the choice of policy instruments available to the governing state. I can see, like, for storable grains, then, like in the case of China, right, then it was more possible to develop taxation based on grain contributions or payments to the government. But I guess if we use the Luigi Pascali framework, if the local main food staples were not storable, like the tuber products, that maybe trade would be the only way to really stimulate this process of fiscal state capacity building.
Yeah, indeed. So one of the main crops in, like, Java, for example, is that cereal crop, like rice, for example. But indeed, so you see New Guinea, the western part of New Guinea, but eventually now it's part of Indonesia, right? So it's also part of the colonial project. So there, historically, a lot of the reliance was indeed on those tubers. And we don't even really see colonial state formation there. We don't really see pre-colonial state formation. But even during the colonial time, so by 1940, for example, in the Indonesian part of New Guinea, there's very little state presence. And indeed, part of the story is the appropriability of those crops. And I think what this story also shows is that labor has a certain level of appropriability that's lower than cash. So there were limits, like legal limits, on how far you could make people go away from their village. So it was about a little bit less than 20 kilometers often was the limit. In that radius, you could make people work, but not beyond that. But if you move to cash taxation, we see that happening in Java. Now these local officials, they're still involved in the tax collection process, but now they're told, after you collect it, well, here you keep 7% collection fee. The rest you need to hand in to the local European official that oversaw like a larger area. And then we see transfers happening, basically transfers going to the center, going to the capital. So that's, I think that's indeed part of the story of this appropriability of taxation plays a role here too, just with labor and cash.
Well, just very quickly, has rice been a locally domesticated thing in Indonesia, or was it brought in at some more modern time periods from India or China?
I'm not exactly sure. I thought it was brought in, but it was brought in way before the colonial times. Like there was substantial state formation in Java already like more than 1,000 years ago. So I think officially it's seen as brought in, but it's a long time ago.
So you don't know what the native domesticated crops are or were.
Well, yeah, so the wild relatives, so like indeed in that Pascali paper, the wild relatives, so I think Indonesia is colored as having only wild relatives of tubers, not having wild relatives of cereals. So it must have been imported in at some point in time. Okay. But a long time ago, I would say, I would guess more than 1,000 years ago for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think this is super interesting, and I have a maybe conceptual question about the overall framework. So when you talk about labor coercion, implicitly it's about the decision of the state who decide whether to coerce those labor force, and it's coercion, so the labor should not have options. But here, when you look at the findings, most of the effects come from the labor themselves deciding whether to ransom or not, whether they opt out. So I feel there might be some misalignment between these two concepts here, and particularly when you talk. So if you look at the labor's perspective, since they have the option, I'm not quite sure whether we should think of it as a kind of reduced in labor coercion, or just think of it as in a simple ROI model that they have, and they choose a different option when the payoff is different. And another related thing I have in mind is that if the so since in the results it's not that they borrow money to opt out with the expectation of a higher productivity in the future. Rather, you mentioned that they are just when they have money, they buy it out. So it seems like maybe another way to think of it is just an income shock. Whether they have that money to pay for their freedom or not. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Okay, no, good points. So indeed, I think, it's partly, indeed, you can see it as an income shock, but I guess it's driven by the earlier productivity shock in a way, right? Like if you produce coffee, now you can sell it at a higher price, so your income is higher, basically. And with the conceptual distinction, so indeed, maybe you could also say the tax is a form of coercion, because they have to pay, no matter, they either do the corvée or they pay the ransom charge, either way. So, but I would say in most of the literature, when labor coercion is discussed, so we see corvée labor as some form of coercion, because basically people, well, they're told to do something and they're not paid for it, and if they don't do it, they get punished. But then often taxation is not seen. Maybe if you're like a libertarian, like libertarians would see it as a form of coercion, but normally it's not defined as one. So indeed, then I see it as, like, I'd say, okay, it's a reduction in coercion, and later it comes back up with the Great Depression. But indeed, it's a shift from one form of taxation to another form of taxation. So that could also be one way of, I think, conceptualizing this story. And I think what's interesting in what we see here, that in some settings, people, if like their income is very low, they may actually prefer to pay in kind. So in a way, they may prefer the coercion rather than the taxation. If you have so little money and you know you need to buy some goods at the market to live for a year, you'd rather the state not take that money from you, but maybe you work for the state for 3 weeks a year, especially if you can do that in time of the year when you're not very busy. maybe the agricultural slack season, for example, then your opportunity cost is particularly low. So yeah, I think that's another facet here.
So actually, Mark, anything the government does, right, is based on and backed by coercion. Without the coercive power backing government actions, then the government cannot do anything. So it's not just formal taxation that's coercive. Anything the government or any government does really is based on the legal monopoly of force that government can use. Anyway, just to correct what you were trying to say a moment ago, political scientists would say anything the government does is necessarily coercive.
Yeah. Although different forms of taxation, you could say, it could have different levels of legitimacy. So I think one issue that you see sometimes like described here is with the Corvée data, it left so much discretion to local officials. They could distribute the Corvée. So let's say the people they like, maybe they make them work less Corvée and make them do something that's like a less heavy task. And the people they don't like, maybe they can make them do the heavy work, for example, or more days per year. And that discretion goes away in a way with the ransom charge and also with the head tax, basically.
Okay, yeah.
I think another question in the back.
Samuel.
Okay. Just wonder, in terms of these Corvée tasks, do you make a distinction among different tasks in which actually certain kind of inducement actually is provided by the government, not just a coercion? The reason I raised that is because in Mesopotamia, that's oftentimes in national and state building projects. Oftentimes they produce some substantial actually inducement actually for the labor, and because that's the building projects, national building projects, are not necessary, not just only for building these actual infrastructure or temples or palaces, but they were basically important projects for national unity. It really has political purposes actually. So I just wonder whether you make distinction among these different projects for which actually the Corvée labor actually was employed.
Yeah, no, good question. So I don't do that at the moment. So I didn't collect the individual, so all those different projects, I didn't collect like per type what the Corvée was used for. I could try and do that indeed, like what's the use for, like roads, for example, or transporting government officials was another type that Corvée labor could be used for. So about national unity, maybe not directly. Maybe part of the story is that because it was also a colonial state, they didn't necessarily have a strong interest in trying to build national unity. But through perhaps the road network, for example, you could say there's more market integration. People become more, they interact more with each other. So you do see eventually, especially in this time period, 1900 to 1940, you do see this Indonesian national identity really arise. So I do think part of the story is that, well, technology is improving. People are publishing books, for example, they're interacting more with each other. But as far as I know, with this Corvée labor, it was really used for those relatively small scale infrastructure projects. Yeah. So not directly, maybe the same as in Mesopotamia, where they, or something like the Great Pyramid of Giza, right? Like something of, I don't know, unifying value. That didn't happen here, yeah, as far as I know.
Yeah, because the reason I raised this is because oftentimes we have, this kind of a impression that oftentimes actually these big projects like in Egypt or Mesopotamia, national projects that were really done by coercion. But the fact that actually there was quite a bit actually inducement or incentive provided during this active labor force actually make the whole experience very positive.
Yeah.
Rather than just very painful or kind of just that's something actually, according to textual evidence.
Yeah. So to some extent, these laborers also had were induced, especially if they could work on local infrastructure that's useful for themselves. So then they would benefit through that, like through this public goods provision. But you also see in the written text that, well, sometimes these officials, they would not use the corvée laborers for very useful, like small paths that they connect villages. They would build like a major road that the state can then use for in case of trouble, for example. They can send the army down the major road. And it's something that could be easily inspected. So if the higher up official comes to the lower level official and asks kind of like, well, what have you done lately, right? How have you spent the corvée labor? They can point to this major road, for example, like, look what I did here. So the inducement was indeed part of the corvée labor it produced some public goods, and that value would go back to the local people as well. But part of it was used for not very useful goods, you could say. And when it gets replaced, like with cash, then the state uses that cash to hire laborers to provide the same public goods, basically.
And I think one of a good example of this actually is about positive experience of these project, state and national project. It really actually has to do with the medieval cathedral building. Oftentimes actually is a community exercise during which actually really was a sense of pride, and also people contributed that, not only actually just coerce, but also voluntarily actually to contribute money and labor. And also that was time of festivity. So that itself actually, it's quite different from what we perceive actually what these huge projects, national projects, was like more kind of a coercion, but rather actually can be quite a positive experience for political ends actually.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, you guys can discuss further after this. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's, so there's no question from the online audience. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right, thank you.